So today we're going to look at we're kind of take a departure a little bit from the historical narrative we've been focused on, which has come from experimental film. And now we're going to kind of flip the switch a little bit, or change it up and say, well, what's going on where music reaches out to art? Because so far it's been largely the visual reaching out to the sonic for inspiration. So, for example, Kandinsky looking to music as being a way to organize his painting, and then film looking to music as a way to paint in time. And we've followed that thread until we get to Jordan Belson, who's finally combining media, but still remains in his background historically an artist, a painter. And John Whitney, I guess, is the closest we've come to someone who's coming from the musical side, but largely becomes a visual artist, right? And eschews his use of sound composition. But we did have this interesting thing that happened with Oscar Fischinger and Norman McLaren figuring out, well, and I guess the Whitneys as well, figuring out that we can synthesize sounds on the soundtrack. So we're drawing sounds now. And from that tradition, we arrive in the 50s, and really before that, but really in the 50s, when we start having electronic music, which doesn't necessarily have a score. We start seeing graphic scores arrive. And what's particularly interesting is the graphic score known as the listening score, or the Hörpartitur. So a score made specifically for the act of listening to electronic music. So this, in some cases, is not done by the composer. It's done by somebody else who's making a visual representation of electronic music, so that we have some way to try to analyze it, right? That's notated. So we're going to look a little bit at that. Now, all graphic scores are not that. That is a subset of graphic scores. And other graphic scores sort of are trying to find a way to use the visual realm to express other musical ideas that haven't really been put down on paper yet. And to this extent, we kind of look at a time-space paradigm to get a little sciencey about it. So we have this sort of spatial organization, we have a time organization, and we're looking to combine those things in some sort of way. And that has been in the air since the early 20th century. So when we talk about Einstein's view of time versus Newton's view of how the universe works, we start seeing this commingling of time and space, which is really quite apropos to film and audio combining. So we have a time-based art and spatial-based art, and now we see that they can sort of be one and the same. So the Einsteinian view of things is that time and space are not separated, right? So what does that mean? What am I talking about? Alex, what am I talking about? You know what I'm talking about.
It, so, I got a little lost what you were saying. So you're saying how we organize?
Well, I'm saying what's Einstein's, what does he say about
Theory,
time and space?
theory of relativity? How
Okay.
I haven't done this in a while. It's warped. Time is warped compared to the.
That's right. So time kind of bends around large spatial objects, right? Hence my website name, Time Bend. Um, and that's interesting. So we have this interrelationship of space and time. And so I just wanted to point that out, that this is
But
kind
it's
of in
not,
the,
it bends around mass and density. I mean, some black holes are tiny, right? Like it's
that's
not
right,
really, it's not the space of the object, it's the mass of it.
the mass of the object. There you go. But that object exists as a spatial entity, I think. Well, I mean, I guess a black hole maybe does not. So that's interesting to think about.
It's like a point, right? A
Yeah.
black hole.
It's
And,
density, not mass, because it's
But then
black hole has no mass.
he also uses speed because he says that the faster you're going, the slower the time is or time passes by.
that's right. So if we're going closer to the speed of light, we're closer to making time stand still. So time becomes, and this is interesting to think about. I mean, I only have a C minus popular mechanics understanding of it, obviously, but it's interesting to think about that these ideas are kind of floating around in the general population by the 1950s, right? Everybody has heard about Einstein and heard that time is not necessarily uniform, that we have multiple times, and that there's some linkage between space and time, as I would call it, space-time continuum. Anyway, so around 1952 or so, there's this graphic score called December 1952 by Earl Brown. And what it looks like, let's take a look at it. What it looks like, and I'll show you, is it looks like a lot of vertical and horizontal lines that have no known musical notation. And the idea is that the performer is going to navigate this piece and play what they see. So Earl Brown says about it, he says, he suggests the performer view the two-dimensional score as a three-dimensional space to navigate. So when we look at this, we're supposed to imagine it in 3 dimensions. So this relates to where we're going to go, where we're going to be in 3-dimensional virtual space soon. And we're going to be navigating that space with relation to music. So again, we have reference to the still graphic having inherent time-based elements. So Brown asked the performer to bring these spatial elements into temporal form. So let's take a look at what I'm talking about. It's easier to see this. And welcome to my world. Okay, I think that's good enough for that.
You mean big people there?
Oh yeah. Well, actually, I had a really interesting conversation yesterday with John Crivet, who runs the Hey Audio Student Facebook page and is the audio engineering education chair, maybe. Used to be the president of AES. So I was talking to people in high places, I suppose.
Apparently there's a music department announcement coming today or something.
Yes, you want me to tell you about it?
Sneak peek.
Yes.
Does anyone already know about it? I'm just curious if the...
Oh, I've been thinking about it all morning because why would you
Yeah,
preface an announcement with an announcement?
Because
Okay, well let me let me put on my announcement.
pizza party.
Hey everybody, I have an amazing announcement for you. As of today, we are quite honored, and really it's a remarkable time in the Department of Music's history that up to this point, we have just been known as the Department of Music. But starting today, thanks to a very generous donation from Gretsch, Fred Gretsch and his wife, we will now be known as the Gretsch Department of Music. Okay.
Really?
That's cool.
So we
That's
just
awesome.
got a big donation, basically.
You better get a goddamn new drum set.
I think there's money in there for a new drum set.
Who is Gretsch?
Oh man.
So Gretsch is the person that made...
Ah, the
That Gretsch? Why do they care about us?
Well, Fred Gretsch lives in Savannah. So that,
Oh my god, okay.
No fucking way. That's really cool.
Yeah, there's a whole like Gretsch, like educational thing that we do.
Well, I mean, it's really cool that they gave money to the program.
I'm
it's
glad
been a
we're
long time coming.
Wonder
really
what
cool.
that money is for. Are they going to increase the graduate student assistantship?
Yeah.
See,
Well, I think that what because we've known the Gretsch family for a long time, and I think what pushed it over was the acquisition of the Armstrong campus and their move toward a music industry degree.
sick.
Listen, we could be doing way. All right, I got to talk to Harvard because we could be doing way more with them if they even know who we are.
Gretsch?
Yeah.
Or,
Yeah, I mean, they must know other manufacturers and other people that can come talk about it and help build programs. And
well, I'm just a faculty member here in my small bicycle lane on the interstate. Okay, so we were talking about Earl Brown, who did not give any money to our department at all, but we will look at his piece. So hopefully this shows the picture. It does not. So I'm going to let this ad play before I share sound to
This
spare
is
you
the
that.
free thing, right?
All right, so here is the image we're looking at. This is the score. So he signed it right there. Earl Brown, December 1952. We have vertical and horizontal lines of varying thicknesses, which we are supposed to perceive not as a flat image, but as a three-dimensional space. And so without much instruction, but with the advantage of current context of music in 1952, we have what we're going to hear now. So let me try to make, there we go, new share the sound. All right, so we'll listen to 50 seconds of December 1952.
That's actually pretty easy to follow, surprisingly. You could see exactly which line was each note grouping.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I guess there's some interesting questions here. You know, what pops to your mind? I know what pops to my mind.
I wonder if that drawing has anything to do with what was just played.
Well, we could assume that it's an honest attempt.
Okay, so is this like a graphical like afterthought, or is this like? Also, is this piece different every time?
It would be different every time. It is completely improvisational. Well, it is structured improvisation in that you're supposed to imagine you are in this 3D space and these lines indicate something to you.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
I guess I have questions about why those notes? Why those clusters? It seems like we're avoiding reference to things of the past. So does anybody have a good answer for that?
Say that one more time, please.
So why these notes, right? Why this interpretation, right? Is that a good interpretation? Why these clusters? You know, why the sort of forearm on the piano sort of sound? Why do you think they're choosing to interpret it that way?
You mean the performer, right?
The performer.
Yeah, I think there's thickness and value and weight to certain things. And what's interesting about this is that the muscle memory of each given performer will betray them. And even if they think they're doing something really random, they're probably playing something that they might have played before, unless they're really doing the forearm thing.
Right.
When they'll think they're saying something random or playing something random, but they're actually playing shapes that are familiar. So that's an interesting aspect of this piece being interpreted.
Kind of reminds me of Perez a little bit, like like what we were doing in Contemporary the other day, where he's just kind of like making a soundscape. I don't know.
Well, I mean, I
all
like
these
that
things
comparison to
combined.
Perez because Perez talks about sound kind of existing in these planes that jut out into space, right? So these physical objects that collide, and
Yeah.
parameters of the different planes will pass from one to the other. So we kind of have that sort of idea here, like if we imagine drifting through a 3D space with these sort of planes in it, that maybe those are sonic entities.
I'd really like to see this, like a few interpretations of this, and then like see like the decisions graphed out like over time. Like,
Yeah, that would be an interesting study, actually. What strikes me is that there's an avoidance of trying to refer to things that we are familiar with. It seems, although now we're familiar with this, so that's interesting. And here, I guess what I'm trying to point out is that there seems to be an aesthetic that does not want to comment on music itself, let's say, but wants to sort of break away again and find new territory. We don't have someone interpreting this as triads, although there's nothing saying that this couldn't be tonal music of some sort, but somehow it wouldn't be appropriate, right? Because there's some sort of still modernist aesthetic in this of breaking away. Although here we're kind of getting to something interesting in that we have no defined structure. So there's not this feeling that the artist, the composer here, is in direct control of all elements. That's interesting to me. It's not a piece I dial up on the car radio a lot. Okay, so December. Yeah, go ahead.
That I don't really well now that you explained that it's just like a response to the tradition before it. But otherwise, if I hear this, I don't really know what to do. I experienced what you said about the museum. Like, how do I experience this?
Yeah, I don't know if I have a good answer for you because, for me, as far as my likes and dislikes go, this piece doesn't do much for me, honestly. I mean, I like the idea. And so I have to kind of think of it in a different space for me. Like, make no assumptions about anything and kind of move myself into a John Cage space of like, well, it's just sounds. And the sounds don't necessarily have anything to do with what came before or what comes after. They're just events. And so in that sense, it can be meditative, I suppose. But for many people, I imagine, this doesn't really meet a lot of their expectations of what music's supposed to do. And I bring it up here because we have a link here, and in my mind, room for improvement of, oh, well, if we were doing this today, and I could actually make a 3D space like this, and I don't have to rely on a performer necessarily, I could just have a user navigate this space. How could I load each of these shapes with sonic potential so as we move through, the piece plays itself, for example? So kind of looking forward to that.
Well, it looks like MIDI.
I have a
Yeah.
thought. Yeah. About this piece was that it was played almost like it was MIDI. So like the horizontal lines are a single note, while the vertical lines are a bunch of stacked notes, and that's why those ended up being clusters. And the higher the note up on the page was, the higher it was on the piano, and the lower it was on the page. The
Yeah,
lower it was on the piano.
Yeah, and I think that for me, that's not the way I would interpret this based on the instructions. We're supposed to be in a 3D space, right? And if we're really in a 3D space, there's nothing really to say which way is up necessarily, right? And there's nothing to say that I have to move from left to right or anything like that.
Well, actually, I'm trying to read it from diagonal. I thought I was going to go from bottom left to the top right. But anyway.
Yeah, and it could be that what we're seeing, right, maybe these thicker lines are just ones that are closer to us. And then I think, if this really is some sort of interactive sound garden, not the black hole sun type, then as I'm navigating this in 3D space, I mean, it's totally possible that based on my movement in the space and maybe even my actions in the space, that these things could react to me. And then if I start thinking about it, in even more current terms, I think, well, what if these things were networked together in some way so that the action of one influenced the action of others? And then all of a sudden, this December 1952 piece becomes really quite current in what it could be, given the technologies we have. And maybe the idea of Earl Brown, because when we hear it to me, when I hear it in the piano form, which it's meant for, I just feel like it sounds kind of dated. And maybe I don't get the idea, as Andres is saying, maybe I don't get the idea of what we're supposed to be doing here. But I think maybe somewhere inside this concept, there's something rich and forward-looking that maybe isn't even possible until 60 years later or so, when we can actually be in this space. I guess you could physically build a space like this, but to me, like a virtual space like this actually has some interesting possibilities if we think about what's happening here. So this is a series of work called Folio that explores notation. So Earl Brown is kind of interested in indeterminism and the idea of what needs to be stated by the composer and what can the performer do and what results can we get from the performer. So what other music do we have going on around 1952?
This is, let's see.
Cage was getting started, right?
Yeah, I was about to say Cage.
Yes, so Cage would be aware of Earl Brown, obviously. I think 1952 is a pretty seminal year.
In the art music world or in all music?
In the art music world.
It's like right after World War II.
Yeah, I don't remember if I'm correct, but let's find out. We'll find out when 4 minutes and 33 seconds was written.
I can't remember if it's 60s.
Second link was for sheet music for this piece.
1952 is 4 minutes and 33 seconds.
Oh, wow.
So that's the atmosphere we're dealing with, right? Like, let's allow sounds to be freed from constraint, which is an interesting thing to do when you're a composer.
This is also like the time of Pierre Schaeffer, isn't it?
That's correct. It is also the time of integral serialism.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting that there is a larger discussion here amongst the integral serialists and indeterminists and Xenakis, who we'll talk about later. So Stockhausen is doing 12-tone work, not just Stockhausen, but Stockhausen is doing 12-tone work that not only deals with pitch, but also serializes rhythm, articulations. Everything is serialized, right? Everything is controlled, sort of controlled random, though, right? So, and this is, well, it's not controlled random. It's controlled determinism. And what we find, and I used to play this game, maybe we'll play it later, is the game, is it Cage or is it Stockhausen? Right? And it's hard to tell. Because as Xenakis points out, when we control everything in this deterministic way of even distribution of notes through the 12 tone, and even distribution of rhythm through permutations of rhythm this way, what we end up with actually is white noise, right? Evenly distributed noise. And so the difference between totally random and totally controlled actually ends up being perceptually very small, which is interesting. And so then Xenakis has a different proposal, like, well, maybe we should have stochastic music, where the randomness of it is directed. So much like you don't know where a water molecule is going to go when it goes down a waterfall. But we kind of know that most of the water is going to go down the waterfall. The path it takes to get there is somewhat random, but within constraints, right? So right now, as a matter of fact, probabilistic, a probability says that some of me is not here on Earth, right? Some of me is somewhere else. But most of me resides right here and is sticking right here where I am. Okay, so a little sidetrack there, but it's interesting to see what this simple piece sort of elicits. I think it's fascinating. So speaking of John Cage, he has this graphic notation for for Fontana mix. So this is something that we've done here before, and I had to create all of these things. But it comes in different sheets. And so the sheets are, we can do it. The sheets are transparencies. And on some of the transparencies, we have this graph paper here. And then on others, we have these dots, and then there's these lines that intersect. So you just kind of lay these 3 sheets of paper over each other according to his instructions. And then where things intersect become events that are to be played, right? So you can generate scores this way. Cage generates a tape piece, the Fontana mix, using this method. What strikes me about it is that it's obviously quite interesting to look at, right? And it would have been just as easy, I suppose, to sort of use the I Ching to randomly select things, but here he chooses a method that says, well, let's look to visual arts and what might be interesting visually. I mean, this is interesting visually. and then to say, well, how do we then translate this into music? So again, the point of this is that we're looking at now, how do composers and musicians start to look to the visual arts to free themselves from their time-based art, right? So Cage thinks that in music, time is music. I mean, that's the most important thing. And that all that remains from the prior world of music to the future world of music is form, which is basically the structuring of time. And so it's interesting to look at how he's using spatial ideas to inform how he's going to structure things in time. So it's almost a flip side of what we've been talking about. When a musician writes a score that must be mechanically carried through, compelling the interpreter to follow, it is as if he was a machine. What's the sense to make it for a human being if it can be made for a machine? A music score that imposes such a severity has no sense. Ideas must be free, and the musician who will play must be creative. So what does he mean, John Cage, when he says this?
Means he hates Stravinsky.
Maybe. What do you mean?
So just reading from a page is like just following an instructor's manual, not being creative.
Well, I guess what he's saying is that if you're Stockhausen writing integral serial music where every element is controlled, right? So we're not really talking about Bach here, right? Where there's actually very little on the score, right, to tell you what to do. There's notes and rhythms, and you follow those at a tempo. But other than that, I mean, there's not too much to tell you what to do. You get to put something into it. But we've gotten to a point in 1952 with the integral serialists where they're telling the performer what to do at every step. And also at this time, speaking of Stravinsky, went to the Columbia Princeton Electronic Music Studio where they had this RCA computing machine that could generate music, right? That could synthesize music, and it could play any rhythm or any pitch you gave it. Right, so if you gave it all the information, it could play exactly what you said, right? And we eliminate the performer entirely. So to kind of get into the mindset of why someone would do what Cage is doing here, it's because he says that to determine everything for the player, and this wouldn't be what the final score looks like, but this would just inform somebody. But to determine everything for the player is pointless. I mean, they're humans. They should have something to do, these performers, besides try to be a machine, right? So there's this play at work here in the 50s between being a composer that determines everything and being one that determines very little.
Is this around the time that Milton Babbitt wrote the article?
Who cares if you listen? Yeah, I think that's probably 1954. Let's find out for sure, just so we're informed. It wasn't called Who Cares If You Listen, by the way.
Yeah, Dr. Harwood told us last night that it was
Titled.
Who Cares If You Listen is an article written by the American composer and published in 1958 in High Fidelity magazine. And the name of it is not that. And I'll let you guys figure all that out. Okay, so there we have some interesting sort of visual work of John Cage, which anybody can do. It's meant to be rearranged. This isn't fixed, so you make your own score. So in addition to the performer not being told what to do, here even the composition is such where it is sets of pieces that someone else puts together to make their own score. So the composer has removed himself even from that process. Fascinating. All right, so there's a guy named Cornelius Cardew, and there's a few sets of pieces that rely here on graphic notation. He had an orchestra that he put together of sort of amateur musicians, just whoever wanted to play, called the Scratch Orchestra. And they would make music that was experimental. And Cardew comes up with this piece, Treatise. And what I'm going to show you now is what we did at a Channel Noise a few years ago, but I'm not going to play you the audio that goes with it. I'm just going to play you the score we made. So Treatise is many, many pages, like over 100. And so to do the whole work would be long. And so we just chose a few pages and put it together ourselves. And the way we did it probably isn't the way that Cardew would have wanted us to do it, but it made sense to us in that this is not meant to be read in time left to right. You're supposed to interpret each page, but we did it this way. So here is just the visual aspect of this piece by Cornelius Cardew.
There's supposed to be sound.
There should be no sound. You should hear it in your head. 1. Okay, and then with the help of modern technologies, you know, we kept going, and and these are just the pages of the score, right? That would inspire you to have a structured improvisation. Cardew would not have presented it this way. Obviously, there is no scrolling score, but I found this useful in our context. So directly along that line, we have The Metaphysics of Notation by Mark Applebaum, a fantastic composer, a great mind. And so here's what that looks like in the same vein. We won't watch all 16 minutes. So here we have visual art, essentially. You know, writing the score now becomes a Kandinsky painting or a Juan Miro painting. And then the way that this gets played is purely inspired by the visual. Okay, so let's listen to something made for the layman. Here's a newscast with a newscaster's voice talking about this particular piece and its installation in an art museum.
There are 3 reasons why you might want to cancel your gym membership. Hey, I'm Mark McKillier, and I'm a 57-year-old.
Very nice.
It's synergy, art and music joined into one at this unique exhibit. This is an installation here at the Schneider Museum of Art called The Metaphysics of Notation by Stanford University composer Mark Applebaum. And all of these works here are parts, they're 72 feet long in total. Each of them is 6 feet wide, and they are alternate forms of music notation.
Although Applebaum is a composer, he drew each one of these lines not as an instruction, but more as a suggestion.
When he composes these, he has no sounds in his head, no pre-imagined sounds, but he is sure that it is music. And so he invites people to interpret these on whatever instrument or voice or medium that they are performers of, and to interpret the works however they see fit.
On this Friday, the audience is hearing Compas, a percussion trio play their interpretation of Applebaum's work.
You know, that could be interpreted as maybe some little short things that get gradually louder and faster.
Not only will each musician have a different interpretation, but that interpretation will change depending on their proximity to the art.
Usually you think about a musician playing Beethoven sonata, and they're tweaking it, they're thinking about how it was written at that time and what it sounded like then, sort of standard of what it is. Here there's nothing, there's no precursor for what it should be. That's very exciting.
Between the audio and visual stimulation, the senses can be on overload. So how are you supposed to get the most out of these performances?
I think people should be open to experience something different than they ever have. They should be open to wander around and look over our shoulders if they want, or really experience it not in the typical audience-performer relationship.
If all this sounds too deep to take in one afternoon, you could always go for a more surface approach and find Applebaum's signature, which he hid in each one of the drawings.
I think is kind of interesting.
There you go.
We should take one of these pieces and scan the images into my Max Final project from last semester and see what it sounds like.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Were these people friends with like free jazz players at all, or was that like an East Coast, West Coast thing?
I'm not sure the answer to that, but it certainly would have been on their radar, right? There's no doubt with Earl Brown, who's a New York guy, so this is New York, would have had this on his radar. I mean, it's uptown versus downtown classical music in New York, or new music. And here we have kind of a university sort of uptown aesthetic, but certainly informed by what's going on in New York and Chicago and the free jazz scene. Absolutely. That's all very connected. All right. So I mentioned last time we were talking about the Vortex concerts and how they were bringing together tape music and projection and kind of making big experiences and doing that within a planetarium. And we mentioned that they went to Brussels for the World's Fair, and didn't have a good time. Whereas Xenakis and the Phillips Pavilion, along with Varese and Le Corbusier, had a great time with their very well-funded 400-channel big building installation that they created. So are you guys familiar with the Phillips Pavilion? Have you seen what it looks like? Well, let's take a look. So Phillips, spelled with one L, looked like this. Oh my God. Look like this. And so you see that these are ruled surfaces, or in the case of Xenakis, hyperbolic paraboloids. So these curves are made from straight lines. So these are actually pieces of rebar, I think, laid in, and I believe this was all concrete. So making this gigantic structure. And so people were lined up to go in, and you went inside, and it was this big experience with images projected and sound all throughout it. And actually, the inside of this was sort of shaped like a stomach, so it was meant to digest people and then put them out the other end. Kind of an interesting thing. But this shape right here, remember this. So if you were making something that tied together the different modalities of architecture, so now 3D building construction and music, and it used straight lines to create curves, what would that be musically? And in fact, this building is completely tied to the plans for Xenakis' orchestral piece, Metastasis. So, what do I mean? So, Metastasis, okay.
Booking a family vacation in a Verbo means leaving all the craziness behind. Well, maybe not all of it.
Not all the craziness. So here, in sort of the larger sketch, this isn't the score. So the score of Xenakis' Metastasis is written for divided string orchestra. So every section is divisi. So all the violins play their own part. All the cellos play their own part. And there's percussion, I think. Yes. Maybe it's just string. I'm getting it confused with Pithapratka. So, sorry. Anyway, so we have this sort of structure, and if you look at this structure, it's very similar, right? And here's another part of the structure. And if we look at his plans a little further, then we see that the building and the piece are coming together at the same time. So this piece is from 1954, I believe, so precedes the building by about 4 years. Let's take a listen to at least the first part of it, so that we'll hear the glissandi related to this building over here. And I'll kind of leave it like this. All right, so few mistakes there by me. That's obviously a full orchestra. Got to have trombones if you're going to do glissandi. There's a few interesting things going on here. And since we mentioned it before about the connection between Cage and Stockhausen, and here we have Xenakis doing something different, right? We see in his notes here that there's the sort of macro order, and then these microstructures talking about disorder to ordered, or the continuous to the discontinuous. So he tends to do things like, for instance, right here toward the end of this section, he's going to get back to smooth glissandi, which are the continuous things, as opposed to the discontinuous things, which would be individual notes. And the way he moves from section to section will be to stochastically move there. So not to just jump there, right? But to slowly introduce elements that will move us there, and in that way it becomes probabilistic. And other pieces of his explore that more. Here what we're looking at is the connection between the visual and the musical, and even taking it so far as to say that architectures can cross over this line. So the architecture of a score or a piece can be the architecture of a building in some way. So Xenakis was an accomplished architect, which is interesting to think about because we know him primarily as a composer. And he saw the chief difference between music and architecture as that while space is viewable from all directions, music can only be experienced from one. A preliminary sketch for Metastasis was in graphic notation, looking more like a blueprint than a musical score, showing graphs of mass motion and glissandi like structural beams of the piece, with pitch on one axis and time on the other. In fact, this design ended up being the basis for the Phillips Pavilion, which had no flat surfaces, but rather the hyperbolic paraboloids of his musical masses and swells. Yet, unlike many avant-garde composers of this century, the 20th, who would take such a thing as a completed score, Xenakis notated every event in traditional notation. Interestingly, Xenakis is also interested in expressing Einsteinian views of time as opposed to Newtonian. So here's what I wrote about that. Einsteinian views show it as a function of matter and energy, time. Change one of these quantities and time too is changed. Xenakis attempted to make this distinction in his music. While most traditional compositions depend on strictly measured time for the progress of the line, using an unvarying tempo, time signature, or phrase length, Metastasis changes intensity, register, and density of scoring as the musical analogs of mass and energy. It is by these changes that the piece propels itself forward. The first and third movements of the work do not have even a melodic theme or motive to hold them together, but rather depend on the strength of this conceptualization of time. So this is interesting stuff, and there's a lot of graphic scores that we could look at, and I encourage you to sort of seek them out, just as inspiration. So for instance, there is someone named Roman Haubenstock Ramadi, and I don't know if this is going to give us anything, so let's look at images that will show his scores. Right, so here's a nice one. And here we see sort of hints of, Twitter. We see hints of Earl Brown in a score like this, right? So this is I think 1972, and the same sort of idea. We're looking toward visual arts here to sort of inspire the musical, so to break music out of its sort of determinism. And many other composers.
I have a question.
Yes.
A lot of these graphic scores have this similar look to them, the shapes, and I'm sorry. Is there anyone that tried, like, I don't know, like just from like a regular painting, just like try to make it romantic style? Has there anyone that tried going further with the graphic design? I don't know, that's a dumb question.
Um, I don't know. I mean, because I think if we look back at the history of what we're learning, right? So this sort of all springs from a non-representational art aesthetic, and so that linkage of art and music goes way back, right? So we're Kandinsky. So the idea of, obviously there's been lots of musical pieces based on paintings that look like a vista, or ballerinas, or have some sort of representational notion. And I think that there's a Feldman piece based on Rothko's paintings. So Rothko's Chapel probably should be on your radar. So here's Rothko's paintings, and he does these sort of paintings, right, where it's just these colors. Sorry, I'm not very good at image searches. Yeah, so this is a typical Rothko painting. And
was
more,
he the red painting that got like destroyed?
maybe, I'm not sure. Probably, maybe. Anyway, so he does these sort of things, and Feldman does some works based on these, but they don't literally interpret this as a score, right? It's an inspiration. So there's lots of pieces of music that they use paintings as inspiration, but not so many that are saying this is my score directly, right? But there's a line there too, like, well, then what is a score?
I was just curious because some of the graphic art is so beautiful, and I'm like,
well, it is interesting you say that, so I'm going to take a little diversion here. So I mentioned earlier Juan Miró. Does anyone know this artist? And here's what Juan Miró's paintings look like, right? This here. So I think that many, and Juan Miró comes from like a surrealist sort of background, but eventually makes works that look like this. Is a very typical looking painting of his. And if we look at something like the listening score for Ligeti's articulations, we definitely see some commonalities here. Like this little circle right here looks kind of similar to the notation they use, and these little lines connected. We can see that this seems inspired by this. Or it just could be the case that this is what's in the air, right? And people have found something about this that inspires them. But we'll get back to this in a second. And oops. All right, so back to Xenakis. So Xenakis has a long history. Metastasis is 1954 or so. And he has kind of a long history of equating things across disciplines or across modalities. So from architecture or visual things to music. And in fact, at some point, he designs this UPIC system. So the UPIC is a system of computers and peripheral devices that allows the user to generate all aspects of an electroacoustic composition graphically. This was done on a grant from the French government to basically make music available to children. So children would just be able to draw shapes, and they would sound, and you make some relationship this way. So it's like an early kind of computerish system. These aspects can be divided into two levels of composition, micro-compositional and macro-compositional. So what the system did was allowed you to draw waveforms, for example, and then to sort of telescope out and say, well, maybe the waveform becomes the phrase shape as well. And, then telescope out and say, well, maybe the phrase shape becomes the formal shape. And I guess you could telescope out further and say, well, maybe my next 5 pieces follow this same shape. So there's this sort of idea of unifying timescales, which is also something was approached by Stockhausen, but didn't really pan out. So microcomposition refers to the generation of timbres by the creation of waveforms. So these waveforms vary in kind from standard types, sine, triangle, and square waves. that are basic to electronic sound synthesis, and you can also do quasi-random waves that may be designed graphically by the user. So the relative simplicity or complexity of the waveform has a direct impact on the quality of the sounds produced. Generally, simple waveforms produce sounds that are cold and lacking harmonic color, while complex waveforms tend to produce rough, grainy sounds. Those of you who are familiar with Xenakis' music will not be surprised that he prefers sounds in the rough, grainy category. Macro composition refers to the organization of sounds in pitch and time. This organization takes place independently of the choice of waveforms and results in a perceptible structure of the music, which is generated by the composition of a graphic score. Micro composition must occur prior to macro composition, for if no waveforms are selected, the events represented in the graphic score will be unable to produce any sounds. So here Xenakis does the obvious, I think, and he says, well, if we're going to have graphic scores, and unlike what Cage says, if we're going to have graphic scores, we might as well make them instantly realizable in some sort of real concrete way, right? So the way that something is drawn in UPIC becomes the way it sounds, right? There's some software that I've linked that you can check out to kind of look at what UPIC would look like on a personal computer today. And there's also this program called YaniX, which is able to communicate graphical information to various softwares via OSC and MIDI. So that's cool. And we're going to look at that in just a second, or an example of a work that uses that. But first, I wanted to show you the classic Mycenae Alpha from 1978, which is a work composed on the UPIC system. Trigger warning, it is noisy and grainy. For certain. So there we hear sort of the, we can hear traces of metastasis here. The aesthetic remains similar, and you can kind of go through, and these sort of structures here become sort of typical Xenakis structures, and we can imagine what those sound like given this particular system.
Can we see what they sound like out of curiosity?
Absolutely. So we'll, well, so here, you know, it sort of looks like a spectrogram, right? And so we can see that these are probably going to be like harmonically or inharmonically related tones separated by silence. And then when we get here, it's going to sound like sort of noisy, grainy stuff. High sounds that's reached down to the mid-range, and then some full range sound.
That is awesome.
I mean, it looks like a lot of fun, right? It'd be pretty fun. I mean, this 1978, pretty amazing. I mean, I bet it was really fun to be a kid and get to go play with the UPIC system. Except they would all be like, how do I make a drum beat?
Well, either way, for a 25-year-old, that's really fun.
Yeah. Neat stuff. And, you know, you can experiment with that. Like I said, if you look at this high C thing, I think that's probably still a valid link. So Yanni X is a program, and I thought this was interesting because it's this aesthetic of combining media does trace back to Xenakis a great deal. And so this whole program, basically using sort of mathematical formula to generate events, has resulted in this particular performance, which I thought was pretty interesting. So here's Simone Beneventi from the Festival of the International Contemporary Music Festival at the Venice Biennale in October 2012. And so here's just a bit of the performance. So here you see there's a giant sort of percussion structure, and here there's a small projection, and here's a larger projection, and just check it out.
was cool.
Yeah, it's pretty neat. And there's a few things that I find interesting about that, but I think that I'm going to suspend talking about that for a second. But obviously there's different things happening there. It's the organization of the piece and the way the visuals are happening, and what ties all that together is an interesting topic of discussion. Okay, so that's kind of the graphic score route I took for this. And it's interesting to look at this last piece we just looked at and see how things start tying together, right? So we see sort of like this John Whitney-esque sort of graphic look, and now we've got a composer we know, Yannis Xenakis, and this sort of computer technology sort of uniting things together, although we don't really have any electronic sound here necessarily, right? So, okay, so next up, I would like to, let's see if I've got this linked. So lastly, there are a series of listening scores for electronic music, as I mentioned in the beginning. And those are particularly informative for us because now we can look at them and listen to them and sort of get inspiration about what this could be if we were actually putting these together in a real time or in a composed sort of way where one didn't come after the other necessarily. So like I said, this is Rainer Wehinger's listening score for a piece by Ligeti, a tape music piece called Articulation. So I didn't link it, so let's find it here.
That face that is usually covered by her phone has finally made an appearance.
Oh my God. And let me pause for a second. So, music, I'll just read this. Music again intersected the visual arts in the middle of the 20th century via graphic scores and listening scores. Of particular note is Ligeti's Articulation. This is from 1958, which received its listening score, that's what that means in German, and from Rainer Wehinger in 1970. So this is 12 years after the tape music piece is done. And that was done via a commission from the Schott publishing house who had acquired Ligeti. The listening score is not an animation, but it does serve to augment the piece through a delineation of the structure of the work, categorizing timbres and notating spatial placement. So up here we see where things are supposed to be located. That's what these graphics are for. And then here each of the sounds is directly correlated with these graphics. As Richard Taruskin notes, the images are reminiscent of Juan Miro's visual language, which is here, which Ligeti used as an inspiration for the composition of Articulation. So kind of interesting that it kind of comes full circle here. If we imagine the listening score of Articulation as animated and synchronized to the musical features it denotes, then we have a reversal of the typical trend of setting a soundtrack to a film. We set the film to a soundtrack. This harkens back to the work of Mary Ellen Brute. It should be B-R-U-T-E. And we didn't really talk much about her, but she used a lot of sort of oscilloscope sort of features in her films. And Oscar Fissinger's and many others who did just that. While Ligeti's work stands on its own, I must admit I rarely present it to students without the visual guide of Wehinger. Right? So whenever we listen to this piece, I generally show the listening score. And it's worth listening in full. It's 3 minutes and 52 seconds, and let's do it. Okay. So who's seen that before?
Made me think a little bit about the sound that is used for the sound design on the earlier Star Wars movies for the droids and the extraterrestrial creatures.
Yeah,
Yeah,
especially that R2D2 sound.
like an ARC 2600 kind of deal. That's what the sounds for that movie were made of.
I wonder if they use the same techniques to make that sound design.
I don't know. That's a good question. I do find that listening score to be quite remarkable as a work of art just in itself. You can't, well, maybe you can. It's hard to imagine the tedium of taking that piece of music and notating it as it was. I know that because I have done the same thing with one of Curtis Rhodes' pieces, Sonal Atoms, and it was painstaking. Every detail. And there's a separate graphic score of Curtis Rhodes' Sonal Atoms done by James Ingram, who's the person who did a lot of Stockhausen's scores. And I encourage you to find that and sort of follow along. But here, again, we have something to me is quite compelling, which is the direct combination of visual and audio things in sort of an audiovisual composition. And like I said, I do not really present this piece of music without the listening score. To me, it makes a better piece of art when they're both together. All right, well, we've run out of time. You're tasked with reviewing these notes. So let's just look at what I studied today's notes. That's the task. And in addition, I would like you to start thinking about a project. And so I kind of cased this in something interesting, but as we begin to accelerate our pace a bit, so we're going to start moving a little bit quicker, I think, in the technical portion of the class toward an audiovisual project. So I'm going to ask you to do this in a creative way. I'm going to ask you to exercise your creativity here and create an electroacoustic visual music work. This should fall into category C listed below. So Andrew Hill, a lecturer in sound design at University of Greenwich, has written a lot of papers about this. And he describes 4 types of fixed media compositions in the visual field of music, in the field of visual music. And we're talking about C here, the composition of sound and image informed by traditions of music in which materials are structured within time. This form is here defined as audiovisual music because works contain both sonic and image elements. The sound and image are regarded as equal components joined in the context of a work and are both structured musically. A work itself would be an audiovisual composition. And I put it more simply here, base your work on the aesthetics of visual music, tie the audio and visual components closely together. The audiovisual work you make should be high definition, 1080p preferred, or 720p if you can't manage it. And the work should be, around 5 to 8 minutes, but I'm not going to hold you to any sort of time structure. It should be awesome. All right, so right now you're like, I have no idea how I'm going to do that, but that's okay. We're just going to keep on building up techniques. And I think in my notes, and sorry to run over time, but this might be important. In the notes here, I do give some little indicators of how one might work. So here, at the bottom, I say there's basically 3 broad categories about how to combine things. You can do audio kind of first and visual second. You can do visual first or audio second, or sort of a equal distribution between. And maybe the audio and visual result from a third source. And really what happens is that it kind of ends up, for me at least, being a combination of all 3 of these things at some point. But it's an interesting process that I encourage you to take. All right, and with that, I'm going to have to end the class because we have run over time. But I will see you on Thursday. I think we'll continue to have the class, even though that's a day when we're going to be in the hall. And again, I'll send out a little bit more detail about when to meet and try to organize for the Thursday, Friday recordings that we'll be doing. Okay. Wow, lots of chat. I'll look at those later. All right, thanks everybody, and I will see you soon.
Thank you.